Okay. Well, thanks. The really good thing about the lighting is I can't see how many people are in the town hall, so I'm going to assume there's a very large audience out there listening to the presentation. I'd like to thank the Hemp Embassy for the invitation and the organisers of Mardi Gras, and I'd like to also start with acknowledging we're meeting today on Aboriginal land and pay my respects to the elders past and present. When you're up in this part of New South Wales, you get a sense of how ancient the land is, and you get a sense that there have been people who have a far better understanding of how to live on this continent than we do, and it's time we actually got that learning from our First Peoples, and it's time we respected our First Peoples and got a treaty with them. That should be a matter of priority for, I'm a Greens MP, but it should be a matter of priority for every MP and every citizen in New South Wales. I suppose many of you have been out there on the street and seen that the New South Wales Police are pretty active today in Nimbin. And they're not active in Nimbin because there's a whole lot of violence on the streets in Nimbin. They're normally not active in Nimbin because of violence on any particular day, although, you know, like every community, it has the need for some policing. But we have that really, really oppressive police presence, as happens at every Mardi Gras, because the New South Wales government, run by the Coalition, wants to be seen to be doing something about drugs. They don't pretend they're going to stop the supply of cannabis in Nimbin, and no police officer will ever tell you that, but they definitely want to be seen to be doing something just in case a reporter from the Daily Telegraph or a paid-up member of the National Party comes to Nimbin and gets outraged that the police aren't seen to be doing something about Mardi Gras. And of course, as with every Mardi Gras, at least for the last few years, no doubt there'll be a string of police sort of wrapped around the town at every entrance point where they'll be having their mobile drug testing units set up to see if they can get the licence off a few people, not because they're impaired or their driving is anyway affected, but just because the police have been told to take a zero tolerance approach on cannabis, and if they can find the tiniest amount of cannabis in your saliva, they want to take your licence off you for 6 or 12 months. Of course, for all of those bankers and lawyers and others who want to come to Nimbin and use their drug of choice, which is cocaine, they will sail through all of those mobile drug testing because the police don't check for that. So you can see it on the street. You can get a sense of it. It's a tiny amount of the spend that we have on policing drugs, but you can just see a little bit of it here at Mardi Gras, the amount of resources that are wasted on policing on drugs. So we're having to think in my office about, you know, what are the actual costs? What are the police resources? What are the social costs of the war on drugs? And of course, there's the direct costs. You've got the costs of the policing and the justice system. You know, it actually costs money to have a whole lot of police out there spending countless hours with their drug dogs and their searches and their warrants, actually arresting people, getting the evidence together, mounting those drug cases. Then you have the court system, another vast amount of resources in the court system, and then we have the jail system. And in New South Wales, the New South Wales government is keen to spend an extra $3.8 billion, an additional $3.8 billion building new jails over the next 5 to 10 years, many of them privatised jails, in order to house a prison population that in large part is being driven by the war on drugs. It's kind of like a dog chasing its tail. You never get to the end of it. Then we've got the indirect costs. Making drugs illegal means we don't have any control over quality. We also ensure that by making drugs illegal, that obscene profits are obtained from drugs, which largely goes to organised crime, outlaw motorcycle gangs and other organised crime in Australia and around the rest of the world. Individual police programs, we get a sense of some of the costs of that. We have some sense of how much it actually costs to do the drug dog unit, for example, in New South Wales. But then at the end of it, I wanted to talk about a really unusual ally that we probably could have in the war against drugs. And I'll come to why the Crime Commission, which is the lead policing agency in New South Wales, probably the lead anti-organised crime agency anywhere in the country, why the New South Wales Crime Commission is probably our friend when it comes to talking sense about the futility of the war on drugs. So how can you comprehensively estimate the costs, which is what I was asked to do, the actual costs of the war on drugs? Well, first of all, you've got the direct policing costs. That starts at border protection and goes all the way down to the drug dog unit on the street in New South Wales. You've got that immediate criminal justice system costs, lawyers, court time, legal aids, and you've got incarceration costs. But when it comes to police, apart from those direct costs, the millions and millions spent on those different units, we've also got an enormous opportunity cost with what should be a scarce public resource used for the public good. Every time you see a police drug dog on the streets, you'll see plenty of them probably maybe 2 or 3 dogs, but with a team of police on the streets here in Nimbin over the next few days. Every time you see a drug dog at a music festival, every time you go to somewhere, say Newtown in Sydney, and you see drug dogs wandering up and down the streets, or you go on a train in Sydney, Newcastle or Wollongong and you see drug dog operations. And you'll think, wow, that's a waste of money, the drug dog and the police officer, because so far as I understand, no serious drug dealer moves their drugs around on public transport. They don't normally move large quantities of drugs using their Opal card in Sydney. They normally use their Mercedes. So not only is the drug dog and the immediate, the handlers of the drug dog a waste. Remember this, that the police standard operating procedures say that when a drug dog is being used in standard operations, so say out on the street in Nimbin, that the local area command has to provide between 9 and 12 additional officers to have each drug dog operate. So if they're doing standard policing on the street, the police standard operating procedures say, in addition to the drug dog and the handler, 9 general duties police have to be pulled off other work and follow around the dog. And if it's at a music festival, those outrageous moments of criminality at music festivals, they have to have 12 police follow the drug dog and the drug dog operator. That's an extraordinary amount of wasted money. And that is 12 police who aren't actually trying to find people I would consider to be genuine criminals, violent criminals. It's 12 police who aren't dealing with domestic violence. It's 12 police who aren't looking at serious fraud cases. It's 12 police who aren't looking at unsolved murders and bringing serious criminals to justice. And of course, the court resources. Last year when I came up to Mardi Gras, after Mardi Gras, I went down to Lismore and just spent one morning looking at the way that the local court in Lismore was dealing with the dozens and dozens and dozens of cases of individuals who had their licence taken or are having their licence taken off them and being prosecuted by police because they were caught using mobile drug tests. And if any of you know about the way mobile drug tests operate in New South Wales, if you're caught with the tiniest detectable amount of cannabis in your saliva, well then the law says you have to lose your licence for a minimum of 6 months the first time and a minimum of 12 months the next time. It doesn't matter if you were totally unimpaired. It doesn't matter if you smoked a joint 7 days before. If they can detect the tiniest amount of cannabis in your system, well then automatically the law says you lose your licence for 6 months the first time and 12 months the second time. And of course a lot of people are really pissed off about that. And they're being brought to court with these mobile drug units in the dozens and dozens and dozens, and they are literally clogging up the local court. There was one stage where a local magistrate in the northern part of the state, and I won't say his name, was literally bringing defendants forward 10 at a time and saying to them, okay, who's the first offender? Okay, you go over there. This is your first offence. Well, this is how I'm going to deal with you, and you all get the same sentence. And who's the second offence? And they were dealing with these defendants 10 at a time because there were so many drug driving cases coming before the courts that they couldn't get to the work that the magistrate desperately wanted to do, which was dealing with the nasty domestic violence, dealing with the AVOs, dealing with the stuff that the magistrate felt the magistrate had to do. And that's happening all over the state with the failed drug driving tests that they're doing. And you multiply that by a factor of 20 when you deal with all the possession charges, the deemed supply charges. Our courts are overwhelmed with drug matters, and they don't have the time to deal with the serious criminal matters we'd like them to be dealing with. And the same goes for the police, who have to be there in support of every one of these cases. And of course, you've got the social and economic costs of those affected by the laws. And just for a moment, think about how random our justice is when it comes to the way we police drugs and we deal with drugs. You think of a music festival where you might have 3,000 young people, maybe in their university, many of them at university, just starting out on their careers, all going off to have fun on the weekend. Many of them, I hate to tell the New South Wales Police and the New South Wales Government, but many of them will be using recreational drugs. And just randomly, 2 or 3% of them will be caught with drugs. Some of them might be caught with 2 pills on them, or 3 pills on them, or 5 pills on them. If you get caught with 5 pills, you get a deemed supply charge. And just that one random person whose life was otherwise on a nice positive trajectory, maybe just finished university, maybe just starting their career, their entire life is destroyed because they're charged with deemed supply. They can't travel overseas, they can't go to the US, they can't get a job in government, their future career in the law might be all screwed, just through this random outcome of our particularly dysfunctional drug laws. And you multiply that damage by a factor of 100,000 a year, and you realise just how much of that ancillary damage and the ancillary costs of the war on drugs are. But I also wanted to talk about the effect of the war on drugs, the costs to us in terms of the attack on our civil liberties. One of the key campaigns my office works on is the Sniff Off campaign against police drug dogs. And I see a bunch of Sniff Off t-shirts there. Thank you, lovely to see you. And of course, if any of you are on Facebook, I'd urge you either during this speech, if you're particularly bored, or after it, search for Sniff Off on Facebook and follow the page, because we get a lot of the facts out about policing and drugs out on that Sniff Off Facebook page. But the impact on our broader civil liberties by giving more resources to the police and more powers to the police to deal with the war on drugs. And just quickly on the drug dogs, many people in society now accept that we're going to have police just sort of randomly sieving us on the streets, on the streets of Nimbin, on the streets of Sydney, pulling us over and searching us, humiliating us, strip searching us sometimes, about 700 or 800 times a year, strip searching us on the basis of a drug dog indication. That's a real affront to civil liberties. And you add to that, of course, the additional powers police and resources police get in order to deal with drug crime. You can see how it erodes a civil liberty culture in New South Wales, and it, in fact, erodes it across all of Australia. And of course, one of the other key costs is the support of organised crime, and I'll deal with that when I deal with the Crime Commission. And when it comes to cannabis, we're actually losing a key industry. Well, we're losing a key legal industry and making it an illegal industry. So an industry that could actually be flourishing in New South Wales, providing jobs, providing taxes, supporting public education, ends up having a completely opposite outcome, where the hundreds and hundreds of millions, probably billions of dollars in profits a year in cannabis, instead of being taxed and legitimate and going into the productive part of our economy, goes into organised crime, which we then have to add additional police resources in to police the organised crime, an enormous cost. One of my favourite costs is the Stoner Sloth campaign. The initial costs, which is what I have in there, showed that the New South Wales taxpayer spent $350,000 coming up with this great campaign about Stoner Sloth. The ultimate costs ended up being a bit over $500,000 in order to come up with the Stoner Sloth campaign. I assume a large amount of that went on that fabulous costume of the sloth. But it did have an impact, the Stoner Sloth campaign. It had an impact in that it made the New South Wales government look so grossly out of touch that I think the drug law reform movement got a little bit of a push from it. And of course, it's not just the Stoner Sloth campaign. They had the Dob in a Dealer campaign that ran all around New South Wales, the police Dob in a Dealer campaign. We asked the police what their strategic target for the Dob in a Dealer campaign was. And the Dob in a Dealer campaign required each local area command to get a bunch of those pop-up posters. If you can, you know, those you can roll them up. We have one for Sniff Off. You can roll up the little poster and it had Dob in a Dealer and it had a phone number on the bottom of it. And then each local area command had to have their own little Dob in a Dealer thing, and they had to stand in a shopping centre somewhere with about 3 or 4 police and urge people to dob in a dealer. And that was their way of addressing drug crime in New South Wales. That ran all last year. We asked the police what their target for dealers were out of the Dob in a Dealer campaign, what their strategic plan was, and then we asked them if they were having any accounting, how many dealers if they're going to have any accounting about the Dob in a Dealer campaign. We were told there was no strategic campaign, there was no strategic target, it was just part of their general vibe about how they deal with drugs in New South Wales. And again, thousands and thousands of hours of police time spent standing around in shopping centres next to a Dob in a Dealer sign with a phone number that nobody ever called. Great. Different people have tried to work out exactly how much the law enforcement spend is across Australia. And the figure that's normally used in terms of the law enforcement spend on drugs is about $1.5 billion a year. That's taking a proportion of the New South Wales Police Force, a proportion of the Victorian WA Police Force, and a proportion of the Crime Commission and other related. And they estimate that about 70% of the drug law enforcement work that's done by police across Australia is actually done on enforcing cannabis. I mean, an extraordinary proposition, isn't it? Over $1 billion a year of police resources fighting, a weed. Pretty extraordinary. And the Australian Crime Commission, the Federal Crime Commission's illicit drug data for 11-12, which is the last sort of viable set of data we have, found that 65% of drug arrests were cannabis related and about 80% of those were for possession. So, we're spending, $1.5 billion a year and getting a bunch of people with one joint. I mean, that's a really, really ineffective use of police resources. Different studies in the US where they're specialists in the war on drugs, although they're easing back a bit now with some of the states going close to bankrupt because of the amount of money they were spending on police and policing drugs. Suggests that the war on drugs in the US, since Nixon kicked it off in the 1970s, had by 2010 cost the US government, state and federal, over $1,000 billion, $1 trillion. It's kind of an extraordinary figure that you could connect all of Africa with fast rail. You could connect it all with electricity. You connect it all with clean water, and you could probably build schools in the great majority of Africa for $1 trillion. But instead, the United States has actually spent it on their failed war on drugs. And global spending on drug law enforcement exceeds $100 billion every single year. So when we're asked to actually find the final figure, the costs of policing drugs in New South Wales, we ultimately came up with the answer that it was actually impossible for us to actually work out the final figure. It's such a large part of our policing, criminal justice and social budgets that in fact it's the many, many billions of dollars, but we can't give you the final figure. So what's all that money do? Has it worked on actually reducing drug supply and drug use in Australia? Well, the illicit drug market in Australia in 2015-16, this is the estimated street value, was $1.81 billion. I mean, it's a massive, massive market in Australia. And that is despite the billions and billions of dollars that have been spent on law enforcement. And the estimate is that for every $1 spent on policing, organised crime makes about $10. Organised crime is a business. They accept that they're going to lose a small amount of their drugs and a small number of their employees as a result of police action, but the profits are so large, the profits are so extraordinarily large in an illegal market that that policing has only the most marginal impact on drug supply and drug use. And in fact, seizures of drugs do little more really than drive up the price temporarily for that aspect of the illegal market that hasn't been the subject of that aggressive police action. So, In 2015, the end of 2015, we asked the state crime record system called the Bureau of Crime Statistics to provide us with a breakdown of what proportion of the criminal cases before New South Wales courts were actually related to drugs. And they came back to us and said, well, look, you can't really say what proportion are related to drugs because a large number of the property offences and the other minor criminal offences, sometimes quite significant criminal offences, such as extortion and fraud and the like, they all relate to a core drug supply operation, or they all relate to other charges that are attached to a core drug possession or a drug supply operation. But just of the purely drug offences that are in the New South Wales courts in 2015, there were 17,600 people found guilty of drug offences. That's about 15% of all of the guilty verdicts coming that were before the New South Wales courts. Overwhelmingly, that was in relation to cannabis as well. Across Australia, about 12% of the total prison population are doing time for drug offences, costing us, at least a couple of $100 million a year just to hold those people in jail. But of course, I want to emphasise that a lot of the other criminal offences that people get jailed for flow from drug-taking activity or drug use or drug sale or drug dealing within the context of an illegal drug market. Again, I won't dwell on this because I've addressed it in other parts, but just the drug dog unit itself, we finally, after about 5 years of chasing and different ways of asking the questions of the New South Wales Police, we finally got them to admit what the cost of the drug dog unit per year is in New South Wales. And the drug dog unit costs, the direct costs of that are about $9 million a year, every year, just for the drug dogs. And in case I haven't mentioned it before, they get it wrong 75 to 80% of the time. And that, of course, is a massive underestimation of the cost of actual drug dogs and the drug dog operations in New South Wales. Because as I said, every time you see a handler and a drug dog, remember that there are another 9 to 12 police assigned from the local area command to make sure that operation works in the eyes of the police. And the New South Wales Police hire themselves out. You can hire a general duties police officer if you've got an event for $122 an hour. I think that's inclusive of GST. So the costs of those 9 to 12 additional police that go with a drug dog is about $1,500 every hour that a drug dog is out in operation. And so that's a multiple of the $9 million a year that we see from the direct drug dog operations. So, I said at the beginning that perhaps one of our friends, if I could put it in those terms, in the campaign to end the utterly futile war on drugs, legalise cannabis for a start, is the New South Wales Crime Commission. Because, and I'm sure at the time the Labor government that put this into the Crime Commission Act, the Crime Commission is required at the end of every year to report on basically how much use its work was. What effect they had on organised crime, what effect they had on drug supply, how many operations they did. And if anyone ever takes the time to get online and read the Crime Commission's annual reports, you'll get a sense of the utter futility of their mission. And they say it themselves in the clearest possible terms. They say that the rise of public enemies, and there they talk about organised crime, outlaw motorcycle gangs, really nasty, vicious organised crime units, the organised crime syndicates, is almost, in their words, almost entirely driven by the prohibited drugs market. Making drugs illegal funds and creates organised crime. That's what the Crime Commission says. They say it in the baldest possible terms. And then they say, and this is another quote from the Crime Commission, offshore interests decide the volume of drugs that are imported into Australia, and the domestic drug consumption market will consume whatever is available. In other words, the New South Wales Police Force might think they have a role, or the Crime Commission might pretend at different times, or the New South Wales government or the federal government might pretend that their work has some impact on drug use and drug supply. But the New South Wales Crime Commission, who are the kind of highly paid experts at tracking down organised crime and dealing with drugs, they make it clear. It doesn't matter what the New South Wales Police Force does. It doesn't matter what the Australian Federal Police does. It doesn't matter how many border protection agents we have. The people who are deciding how many drugs are on our streets are overseas crime interests who just see us as a market. This is a market for their product, and they work out how much of their product they want to bring here to maximise their profits. And again, in the words of the Crime Commission, this is from their 2015 report, law enforcement efforts around the country have resulted in larger seizures and more arrests, but they have had little, if any, effect on the quantities of prohibited drugs available for consumption in Australia. And in that 2015 report, the New South Wales Crime Commission actually went on and detailed one of their particular operations. And it had been, if you watch commercial news, you would have seen this amazing drug bust where the New South Wales Crime Commission successfully intercepted about 2.5 tonnes of drugs coming into the Australian market, mainly amphetamines and MDMA and some precursor chemicals. And the Crime Commission went on at length about the millions of dollars of resources it spent in identifying where this syndicate was operating. It was mainly, it was entirely overseas interests. They had a couple of local agents. There was a number of different organised crime groupings joining together to do a major importation. And most of that importation was happening through Asian countries directly to the north of Australia. The Crime Commission got wind of it, did some wiretaps, worked with those crime agencies in those other countries, and eventually seized the drugs and made a few arrests. And at the time it was trumpeted as a major success. And the drugs that were primarily intercepted were amphetamines and MDMA. And the Crime Commission went through that, and their analysis was that those criminal syndicates had spent about $20 million on this program, and they'd lost that investment. They'd invested $20 million in this drug importation program, and they'd lost all of that money. All of the major players were overseas. None of them were arrested. A few mules and minor agents were arrested in Australia. They lost $20 million. But then the Crime Commission said, but of course the profits they would have made on selling these drugs, if they'd successfully got them into the country, would have been about $200 million, 10 times their initial costs. And they then say, and I haven't dealt with the extracts here, it would be naive in extreme to think that there weren't many more of these operations that were highly successful. And of course, only 1 in 10 needs to be successful for them to break even. And the Crime Commission went on further and said, even though this was our largest ever bust of amphetamines and MDMA, that the street price of both those drugs in Australia fell during 2015. And they kind of left it there with this sense of utter bloody futility on behalf of the Crime Commission. And I thought, given I'm relying upon the Crime Commission as our friends in this, I thought I'd finish on the words of the Crime Commission in their most recent report, the 2016 report. And they say this about illegal drugs and organised crime in Australia. The illicit drug trade continues to be the main stream of income for organised crime groups operating in Australia. Drugs that are predominantly manufactured overseas continue to command high prices domestically when compared with their cost offshore. As a consequence, international crime groups have continued and likely have increased their efforts in importing prohibited drugs into Australia. ... Why do we bother? So, this year, the New South Wales government drops maybe $1 billion of direct costs of our taxpayers' money on police and drugs and different drug-related campaigns. None of it works. The federal government drops a couple more billion in direct costs and indirect costs on drugs. None of it works. None of it will ever work. The key crime-fighting agency for organised crime and drugs in New South Wales has made it clear in the baldest possible terms. They tell the government every year that you can't end the war on drugs successfully from a policing agency, but we continue to do it. And we continue to do it simply because there's a lack of courage in the politicians who occupy the parliament that I work in, the New South Wales Parliament. They desperately want to be seen to be doing something on drugs. They know it won't work. Their experts tell them it won't work, but they're desperately keen to be seen to be doing something. That's why we've got drug dogs in Nimbin. That's why the riot squad's in Nimbin. That's why we've got mobile drug testing. That's why we have the New South Wales Crime Commission. None of it makes us any safer. In fact, all of it ends up fueling organised crime and making us a hell of a lot less safe. And of course, that doesn't include all of the health costs in an illegal, unregulated market in the absence of things like pill testing. We all know this. Every politician, really, you talk to them, knows this, but we can't seem to actually break the hold that the law enforcement agencies have and the Daily Telegraph and the shock jocks have on drug law in Australia and New South Wales. That's a real challenge. I hope we'll be discussing that at different points over the course of Mardi Gras. Doesn't make any sense. We need to end it. How do we do it? Happy to take questions. Thanks.
Thanks for your words, David. It's a lot of really fascinating stuff. I've just got a quick question. Actually, two questions. Is there a way to get your presentation just to go back over it and read some of those amazing statements?
Yeah, sure. There were too many facts in that presentation. I apologise for that. There really were. We'll put it up on the Sniff Off Facebook page. That'll probably be the easiest way to find it. Yep. We got a police minister in New South Wales, a guy called Troy Grant. He has zero interest in this. I'm pretty sure if you start talking about, if ever the police go, and there are people in the police who realise how futile it is, they will go and speak to him. He just sticks his fingers in his ears and hums loudly until they go away and stop talking to him. And it was pretty much the same attitude from Mike Baird, who had a kind of zero tolerance, moralising approach to drugs. Nobody really knows what the approach of Gladys Berejiklian, the current Premier, is. It's probably a little bit more nuanced. We've just got rid of Andrew Scipione, who was another one of those fingers in the ears, zealots of anti-drug policing. He's gone as the commissioner. We've got a new commissioner. And there are some suggestions that he might be slightly rethinking some of the police resources spent on the war on drugs. But as a general rule, politicians in the New South Wales Parliament desperately try not to talk about it. So from the Labor Party and the Coalition, they desperately try not to talk about it. They don't want to annoy their key constituencies. They're frightened of the power of the Daily Telegraph and the shock jocks. And it's a kind of very dysfunctional feedback loop between Ray Hadley and the New South Wales Parliament that largely determines how politicians respond to the challenge of drug law reform. But they are aware of the fact that the community is moving and they're feeling a little bit more embarrassed by it and slightly more isolated by it. Particularly you'll see it on medicinal cannabis. They're desperately trying to come up with something to be seen to be doing something on medicinal cannabis. They're not really trying to fix it, but they realise that the community thinks they're a bunch of, well, basically nasty, intolerant people by preventing kids with epilepsy, say, having cannabis, and they want to be seen to be doing something. The problem for them is if they ever do anything meaningful on medicinal cannabis, that'll be the slippery slope in their eyes and probably in reality to a decriminalisation and legalisation of cannabis. So the community is slowly forcing them. We will get there. Kicking a lot of them out in 2019 would be really useful, I've got to say, when we have the next state election. No other questions?
I actually just have a quick one.
Yep.
Maybe I wasn't listening properly. You said when they had the dog and a dealer program,
Yep.
so no one called, there were very few responses or no one called or what?
Well, they basically said that they couldn't They couldn't tell who called from the Dob in a dealer work that they'd done, that fabulous Dob in a dealer proselytising that they'd done. They couldn't separate those from the general police work that they had been doing. And like so many things when it comes to policing drugs, the police are desperate to come up with ways that they can't be held to account. They don't want to be held to account for the time that they spend on the war on drugs because they know how utterly futile and resource intensive it is. So, for example, whenever we ask about the successful prosecution rates from the drug dog units, they say, oh, I'm sorry, we can't tell you because we've come up with a really cunning way of not ever collating that data. And that's often the police response to the war on drugs. We've never found out, we don't ask the questions, we don't know and we can't tell you. Yeah.
So the implications of what you're saying, David, are pretty full on because it's essentially saying that you guys who we elect to, make all the wonderful laws and run our country, you're not actually doing it. You're held to ransom by the media and the police. What's going on? We don't elect them.
Well, I think we should be clear about the way that the New South Wales Parliament works. It doesn't work as a place where people come together and do collective thinking or come together as a group of politicians to actually, in the chamber work out difficult problems and try and solve them for the people of New South Wales. Most of the decisions that have been made in the last, say, 7 years of the New South Wales Coalition would have been made by a small group of maybe 5 people. The names of those 5 people in the coalition slightly change over time, but, basically 5 old white guys, maybe 1 or 2 women, come together. They tell the cabinet what the cabinet should think. The cabinet tells the coalition party room what the party room should think, and nobody ever challenges it. We have a few mock debates in Parliament, but it's never about trying to persuade people about what the right ideas are. Time after time, I've seen politicians go into the New South Wales Parliament for the government, and they will have been given, 5 pages of speaking notes about a 200-page bill that they've never read, and just read the 5 pages of speaking notes. At different times, I've seen debates in Parliament on large pieces of legislation where the legislation's still warm off the photocopier. Nobody could have pretended to read it, but they have their 1 page of speaking notes and they just push it through. There's an absence of scrutiny in Parliament, and there's an absence of scrutiny of Parliament in the community. There's that quote from a particularly nasty tyrant called Bismarck, where he says, you don't want to know how sausages are made and you don't want to know how the laws are made. And so often people just don't watch. Yep.
Any other questions or comments?
Alrighty.
Okay, thank you very much, David. And David is going to return on Sunday at 1 p.m. just before the parade to do a workshop on what really negotiating or dealing with one's encounter with police. Is that right?
Yeah, we'll do it'll be a bit more interactive police power workshop.
Yep.
I think 5 o'clock on the Friday was a pretty hard ask for people in the town hall. At least it wasn't 4:20, so I appreciate that. But anyhow, happy to talk. We'll be here for the sniff-off crew, and myself will be here for the next few days. We're happy to talk to people as we wander about.
That's right. There's you guys have got a stall down the
We
back
do.
here. So,
Yep.
And also, I guess your other participation is we do have a few panels happening. There's one tomorrow night and also on Sunday. So that's a great opportunity to, hear the voices from different politicians and other people in regards to things like whether Australia should have a Charter of Rights. It's about, Canada's not really working on that. And then, and also tomorrow night we're actually going to investigate how we can make politicians do what we want. We're the people.
Well, the great skill of many politicians is to avoid doing what you want. So, happy to discuss. We'll explore that, I think, tomorrow evening. Yep.
Yes, tomorrow evening it will be packed, by the way, because
Okay, cool.
everyone will be here waiting for the comedy.
Oh, okay, yeah.
It's like maybe we need to trick more people into coming to these events by telling them there's some comedy on and they turn up and
Yeah.
get a seat. What do you think?
Yeah.
By the way, I am sorry there's not many people, but...
That's my pleasure. Lighting's really good. It feels full. Yeah. Thanks, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks so much.